Right. And for this week, we have invited Mr. Ben Thatcher, who will be giving a talk. So Ben was uh, we all knew Ben when he went informally to ASP, and then there was a lot of chats with a lot of people, and then of course, because the topic is interesting, we also asked him to give a talk here in ASP. And he works with in a program and helping persons with disabilities to get access for work. He was part of the UK emergency medical team, where he helped with training and organizing UK-based rehabilitation profession, with work in onset disaster in low resource setting. Currently, he is volunteering in Life Haven, which is where he works as an intern coordinator. But before that, he also did research volunteers in different organizations. He was also a counselor for persons with disabilities, and he did various research and volunteer works all around the world. He did his master's in University of Birmingham. The title of the master's is The Path to Wellbeing for Disabled Families, a case study in the Philippines. And now he is moving on to doing his PhD under the College of Social Work and Community Development in UP Diliman. So without further ado, let's hear from Mr. Ben Thatcher.
Salamat for that introduction, Anna. Yeah, so I'll just share my screen quickly. Okay, so yeah, so like Anna said, I'm studying my doctorate of social development at UP. My focus is on disability and labour migration, but my research is still in its infancy, so I've decided to take a step back and talk about disability more generally. So I call my talk today Conceptualizing Disability in the Modern World, as we tend to, as a species, inherit the biases and functions of our ancestors, even though our environment has changed quite drastically. And quite a lot of stigma comes from our own perceptions. So I'm going to do a few little tasks throughout to try and keep you more engaged, and it's not just me talking. So first one, I want to ask, what does disability mean to you? So if you could take 20 seconds just to write down somewhere words that pop into your head when you think of disability. I just want to, just so you can do a little check for what disability inherently means to you when it comes up as a word. And don't worry, I'm not going to ask you to share these words. So just be honest and write it down for yourself. Okay, you carry on doing it and I'll just carry on, or that will do for now. So my session is structured into 5 interlinking parts. How is disability modeled? A brief history, are our perceptions justified? What is disability and disability inclusion? Hopefully it will allow you to self-reflect on your own perceptions a little bit and how your perceptions can manifest in reality. I'm going to be describing pictures. My voice is sometimes a bit screen reader tone voice, and that comes out naturally, I don't know why. And I'm going to be using a few words in Tagalog, so apologies in advance for my pronunciation. So first of all, I put this slide in. This slide contains 9 pictures of well-known celebrities. But what do all these people have in common? Well, actually, bar them mostly being Western, as my Filipino pop culture is still not quite up to scratch. But the commonality is, under certain definitions, all these 9 people can be considered having a disability. So we have Stephen Hawking, who has motor neuron disease affecting mobility, Whoopi Goldberg with dyslexia, Stevie Wonder, visually impairment, Daniel Radcliffe, he's got dyspraxia, which is like a neurological condition which impairs organization and movement. You've got Peter Dinklage with dwarfism, Helen Keller, who was the first graduate with deaf blindness in the world, Elon Musk, who's on autism spectrum. We've got Apollinario Mabini, who you're probably all more aware of than me, who have mobility impairment and polio. And we got Frida Kahlo, who had spina bifida from polio also, and an amputee. So all these different properties in humans are kind of put under the definition of disability. And I also wanted to demonstrate that even wizards can have disabilities, and that's quite cool. So conceptualizing disability. So disability studies, disability movement in general have like many commonalities with other social movements like women's and gay rights. Disability studies set out as a discipline to document persons with disabilities' experience of disadvantage, both theoretically and politically, to enable barriers to be challenged. It's an active study trying to map and enhance conditions, which can be empirical, but often political in nature. And disability is a phenomenon that manifests in the world socially or biologically. And like other disciplines, disability studies aims to produce theories. We look at reality, we try to make models. Disability has several models mapping the phenomenon, and I'll go into them in a bit. This slide shows a diagram representing the person with a disability is the problem. So when modeling this phenomenon, two main categories of models do exist. Firstly, the individual model. Disability, under this model, disability is inherent to the individual. So where disability is thought to happen by some random terrible chance, in this model, disability is located within the impaired body, and these models differ in social cultural contexts and have various historical constructions explaining how disability occurs and what this means for persons with disability. Now there is a diagram representing that society, not the person with disability, is the problem. So social models offer a different type of framework. It identifies persons with impairments as disabled by society, meaning that disability is a disadvantages produced by social prejudice, typically in the form of environmental and society barriers. So disability is the model should be accepted. Disability in this model should be accepted as part of human diversity. Calls for social change, removal of barriers, and promotion of disability rights. So the orange of this shift in paradigm happened in the UK disability movement in the 1970s with the Union of Physically Impaired Against Segregation. They view disability in terms of social repression, a social pathology rather than an impairment. And they stated, in our view, it is society that disables physically impaired people. Disability is something imposed on us on top of our impairments by the way we are unnecessarily isolated and excluded from participation in society. Disabled people are therefore an oppressed group in society. So looking deeper into these individual models, here are some of the most common ones. The charity model sees persons with disabilities as victims of circumstance who should be pitied. They're seen as unable to make contribution to society and therefore a burden. They are seen as weak, inferior, needy, and suffering due to their impairment and unable to do what persons without disabilities can do. Policies and procedures using this model tend to create a cycle of dependency. Then we have the religious model, which is disability is regarded as a punishment from God for a particular sin that may have been committed by the person with disability in the past. Person with disabilities are seen as deserving of their disabilities, and this perception leads to internal feelings of shame and guilt quite often. And then we have the medical model disability, which is seen where disability is seen as a medical problem that resides in the individual, a defect in or a failure of a body system, and as such is inherently abnormal or pathological. There's a strong focus on medical solutions aimed at a cure or rehabilitation and normalization. This is common in Western societies during the 20th century with the advance of medical science. Those unable to cope within the mainstream society in the 20th century were often segregated into special institutions. And then last in this, what I'm going to explain is the International Classification of Impairments, Disabilities and Handicaps developed by the WHO, the World Health Organization, in the 1970s. And they developed these definitions. So impairment, any loss of abnormality or psychological, physiological, or etymological structure of function. So I highlight the abnormal in bold. Disability, any restrictions or lack of resulting from impairment of ability to perform an activity in a manner or within the range considered normal for a human being. Again, I've put normal in bold. And handicap, a disadvantage for a given individual resulting from an impairment or a disability that limits or prevents the fulfillment of a role that is normal, depending on age, sex, social and cultural factors for that individual. Again, the word normal is in bold. So what does more normal mean, and what makes someone normal, and is it still relevant in today's world? Or is it kind of an ontological error that we've made? So briefly, Oxford defined ontology as the science of study of being, that department of metaphysics which relates to the being or essence of things, or to being in the abstract. This affects decisions and assumptions we make. And as part of such a study, we use classifications of things that are placed into basic types of normally starting with living versus non-living entities, which expands to mammals, humans, race, gender, sexuality, and disability. Ontology tends to assume the additional meaning of shallow classifications of basic categories. These classifications are needed in linguistics, for example, to formulate rules of the subjects, objects, of verbs that can be taken. These rules become more and more redefined as the classifications supporting them need to be more specific. So eventually ontology was used to designate and classify, particularly in communities of linguistics. The reason this relates to disability is in social categories give order to past experiences and shape expectations about the future. So categories matter because they provide labels that are used to define the identity of objects and adjust individual behavior to social situations. Again, categories matter because they aggregate information they convey, helps to predict features of individual items they contain. As a consequence, categorization drives a number of our day-to-day decisions and biases, such as how we see people, how we design society, or even what movie we watch. So choice of terminology reflects how disability is perceived. So looking historically at some of these models, disability has primarily been seen and associated with negative connotations that seem to be fundamentally built into society. The core rationale for this is that woven into the fabric of Western societies, in particular, is the assumption that human value is intertwined with one's ability to reason, as only rational beings can be moral, resulting in a hierarchy of beings, causing certain characteristics to become undesirable. These have been rooted in the writings of both Aristotle and Plato. So Aristotle believed that people that are born deaf, blind, or lame are unworthy of life and had nothing to contribute to a given society. Plato built upon these, expressing people with undesirable traits should be discouraged from reproduction. These cultural memes have survived and spread throughout the last generations, whereby parents were encouraged to kill children with disabilities. And in the 20th century, these practices took the form of eugenics, and at its worst in Nazi Germany, led to the systematic elimination of over 200,000 persons with disabilities. An article I read in the US argues that even when eugenics lost credibility, its theoretical essence produced secondary effects in terms of institutionalization and sterilization. These ideological legacies of natural hierarchies continue to impact particularly persons with intellectual disabilities today, where sterilization is still a common procedure based on assumption of victimhood or their sexual drive, which is used as a common reason to deny their individual agency. So simultaneously in theist frameworks, a notion of pity arose in institutions such as Christianity, where charity prevailed rather than one of equality. So the Pope tweeted that people with disabilities are a gift for the family and an opportunity to grow in love, mutual aid, and unity. This kind of narrative renders family members with disability as an object rather than an agent. And likewise, this is seen in other systems, such as belief in ancestral worship that entails punishment of persons with disabilities for wrongs committed in a previous life. And anecdotal evidence from one case study I read said that an aid worker in Vietnam outlines despair created by having a child with a disability and described that at its worst, a newborn's life may be put in danger or a child may be hidden away or neglected so that they purposefully do not thrive. Karmatic beliefs tend to be more potent in rural areas, depriving persons with disabilities access to perform rituals, engage in economic activities, and often scorned socially for being inferior. The family is often part of this karmatic retribution, cursed by the birth of disabled child because of their past sins. and are required to accept responsibility of care to sever this sin. In sub-Saharan Africa communities, disability is often associated with witchcraft or multi-generational curse, and as a result, the entire family are treated with contempt and are often stigmatized. This frequently results in persons with disabilities being locked in a house in an attempt to reduce family stigma. So these historical legacies have caused the framing of disability to be embedded with a deep-rooted prejudice in the majority of society's psyche, coupling disability with otherness. And this can be found almost universally with like a couple of sections across cultures, and it descends through generations via stories, language, and often art. This association of having an atypical body coincides with otherness, which acts as a catalyst for the pervasive stigma and exclusion persons with disability face. So in the Philippines, the words for disability that often appear are kapansanan, which is a fusion of impairment with disability and carries negative connotations. Apologies for my enunciation of that. And likewise, kalang kwenta, which is worthless, pagbigat, which is a burden to the family and to society, walang kayanhan, which is not capable, no capacities, walang lakas, weak, no strength, no power, or kawawa, which is pitiful. So this then out of these kind of historical concepts, there's a concept of ableism, which has emerged more recently and suggests disability has been constructed by persons without disability, as well as physical systems and environments. So it basically refers to the discrimination and the privileging of the able-bodied people. So ableism centers around the notion that persons with disabilities are imperfect and in need of fixing. This discrimination can be intentional or unintentional, and it's based on the belief that there is a correct way for bodies and minds to function, and that anyone who deviates from this framework are inferior. Stepping back a little bit to try and further explain these models and the consequences of having one's models, I'm going to try and use a simple example to demonstrate categorization by looking at the animal kingdom. So I wouldn't be a very good vegan if I didn't bring animals into this slide. So on this slide now, there's 5 animals: a camel, a pig, a dolphin, a dog, a cow, and there's 3 categories: pets, wildlife, and livestock. So we tend to categorize animals in 3 main ways, like that is pets, wildlife, and livestock, amongst others. And a common Western view anyway is camels and dolphins are wild, dogs are pets, and pigs and cows are livestock. However, if we look through like the eyes of someone else, for instance, Chinese, Saudi Arabian, or Japanese, the animals that are wild can, in these perspectives, can be seen as food. And this kind of shows that history, culture, circumstance can lead to categorization of criteria, creating arbitrary boundaries to justify actions that can cause unnecessary suffering. For instance, certain perceptions and categorization of dolphins can lead to a better or worse life for them. We also change our perceptions and acceptance over time. And this is a short video of how perceptions change and the way we act. Parents with their children were invited to participate in the educational game.
Your heart sings like a kettle, and your words, they boil away like steam, and the lie burns long while the truth bites quick. Our heart is built for both, it seems. You are lonely as a church despite the queuing out your door. I am empty as a promise, no more. When the time comes and rights have been read, think of you often, but for once I meant what I said.
So that video showed that kids tend to see people as people, and as we get older, we get socialized into normative values. So the video kind of had two parts, kids on one side of a block and parents on the other. And they showed videos of people making funny faces, and it showed the kids mimicking the funny faces. But when the person with disability came on, the parents stopped mimicking the faces, where the kids continued. So then the social model, which provides a complete paradigm shift to this individual model for persons with disability to operate in society. So Oliver, who is a disability studies researcher, defined disability in social model terms. Disabled people will be seen as the collective victims of an uncaring or unknowing society, rather than as an individual victims of circumstance. Disability becomes a disadvantage produced by social prejudice, typically in the form of institutional, environmental, and attitudinal barriers. So disability now results from the interaction between a non-inclusive society and individuals. So for instance, a person using a wheelchair might have difficulties gaining employment, not because of the wheelchair, but because there are environmental barriers such as inaccessible buses or staircases which impede their access. This is in critical studies, disability studies, it tends to entail more the examining the creation of ideas and relationships of the abstract notion of power. So its power is believed to be mainstream dominance by favoring certain characteristics that are built into knowledge itself. So whiteness, maleness, heterosexuality, and able-bodiedness is more postmodernism critique of disability. The social model should not be overemphasized in Southern contexts where disabilities often arises from treatable diseases and where medical rehabilitation or treatment may be the priority for many persons with disabilities. There's a massive psychological value for the social model also, and two academics wrote the social model of disability two academics with disabilities have wrote that the social model of disability gives us the words to describe our inequality. It separates out disabling barriers from impairment, not being able to walk or see, or having difficulty learning, because the social model separates out disabling barriers and impairments. It enables us to focus on exactly what it is which denies us our human and civil rights and what actions need to be taken. And the second one, my life had two phases, before the social model of disability and after it. Discovering this way of thinking about my experiences was the proverbial raft in stormy seas. It gave me an understanding of my life, shared with thousands, even millions of other people around the world. I clung to it. So the individual models have become more irrelevant today because people can now live their life and manipulate the environment in a much more effective way than ever in the past. But the society, attitudes, policies kind of linger behind. So as the modern world is shifting, there are two outcomes of the social model. They've got the biopsychological model, which is a combination of both the individual and social models. And this is common use today. And I'm not going to go too much into that. And we've got the UN CRPD, which is the United Nations Convention of the Rights with Disabilities, is an international human rights treaty of the UN intended to protect the rights and dignity of persons with disabilities. Through it, though it does not explicitly define disability, the preamble of the convention states disability is an evolving concept, and that disability results from the interaction between persons with impairments and attitude and environmental barriers that hinders full and effective participation in society on an equal basis with others. It is the legal tool being used commonly today in an attempt to mitigate negative social externalities by moving attention away from the individual to the failings of society. This change in perspective regarding otherness advances the connection between legal and civil rights, so freedom from, and social and cultural economic rights like freedom to, making persons with disabilities subjects with equal respect and access to human rights, instead of being objects that need to be managed. Again, disability results from the interaction between a non-inclusive society and individuals. Persons with extreme nearsightedness who do not have access to corrective lenses may not be able to perform daily tasks. The same person with prescription eyeglasses would be able to perform the task with no problems. So there's a Paul, one of my lecturers, did some research into models of disability in the Filipino context, whereby the conceptualization and operationalization of the rights-based models orientated stakeholders to frame their policies, funding priorities, operational guidelines, and partnership around it. So the model that funders use tend to dictate the programs that are created. So he did stories from Las Piñas City and demonstrates how the label with disability, Kapasanan, manifests there with neither the social foundation of unity. This acted as a catalyst to frame disability in a more positive light. So what he found was reframing disability as kapasan, which entails empowerment and participation of persons with disabilities as a sector and gives individuals the agency to take control of their own lives. An example of this, persons with disabilities are now being consulted, empowered, involved in implementing and developing their own projects, becoming active members of mandated mechanisms for participation at the barangay and the LGU local government units. Kapasan was coined as a prefix ka, denotes partnership, being included as part of, while the word pasan emphasizes the act of process of carrying. Thus, the construction, meaningful participation, and self-determination of organizations of persons with disabilities play a pivotal role in development praxis and shaping people with disabilities reality. So there are two pictures here of a wheelchair user, one in a ramp and one with stairs. This is my friend Eric, who I work with, and he's showing the difference between barriers and inclusion created by the environment. So ramps instead of stairs offer self-determination. This can be seen in streets of your daily life. For instance, like dog poo become a barrier, or cars parked in a sidewalk can stop access. Here's a diagram showing a star. There's a diagram here showing a star trying to be placed in a box with only a small circular hole in it. So for this activity, the star is too big for the round hole and cannot fit into the box. So what ways do you think we can get this star into the box? Just take 20 seconds to reflect on ways that we get that star into the box. You don't have to write it, just in your head. So I'm gonna give you the answer anyway now. A common answer and easiest thing to do is to fold or cut the star, but hopefully you've kind of seen that this is a metaphor. So this new slide shows 3 diagrams of different shapes trying to get into the box, some with obstacles. So the star represents a wheelchair user trying to get through a door in a health clinic. Using individual model, you try to change the person, but in the social model, you would try and change the whole or remove it altogether. And this is what inclusion is about. This slide has 7 different disability facts splattered across the screen. And kind of my conclusion here. So in conclusion, the world that we inherit is a world made ready for the able body. The able body is the orientation from which the world unfolds. Conceptualizing and defining disability is challenging because it is a low resolution and ambiguous category. There are multiple models that can offer theoretical and practical guides, but the human rights model framework is ingrained within the disability discourse, with the UN CRPD grounded in the biopsychological model is the most widely used approach still. And since the UN CRPD ratification in 2006 to 2008, I can't remember the exact date, there has been an expansion of disability research within the development sphere, and often demonstrating disproportionate disadvantage that inhabits the dignity and meaningful participation of persons with disabilities. So not only disadvantaged in opportunity, but also persons with disabilities face high levels of discrimination in accessing their human rights. A case study in the Philippines that I read demonstrates that women with disabilities with low middle economic social status have a greater probability of experiencing human rights violations than any other demographic group in the Philippines. Hence, it becomes vital to challenge the very nature of ableism within the discourse, as it fundamentally begins with the experience of the majority body and disregards the rights of persons that do not conform to this category. So challenging ableism and contingent assumptions mean investigating and living through a disability lens, and to create the environment so that all persons can be independent, who can contribute to all walks of life, as equality is not a privilege, it is a right for everyone to enjoy. Inclusion means a change in language as it plays a critical role in shaping and reflecting our thoughts, beliefs, and values, and a focus on participation that can remove all barriers and offer support to have persons with disability fully and meaningfully involved in society. Just remember your optics, create the world around you. And this picture shows a person with a different paradigm looking at different elements of development in their daily life. So some of the facts are 1 billion people, or 15% of the world's population, have a disability. 90% of children with disabilities in developing countries do not attend school, according to UNESCO. Unemployment among the persons with disability is as high as 80% in some countries. Often employers assume that persons with disabilities are unable to work. Inaccessible environments and services prevent inclusion. Only 5% of electronic books published annually are made accessible. Research indicates that violence against children with disabilities occurs at an annual rate at least 1.7 times greater than for their peers without disabilities. Persons with disabilities are 2 to 4 times more likely to be killed in disasters, and available data suggests that adult women with disabilities are at least 1.5 times more likely to be physically and sexually abused than women without disabilities. So that concludes my talk. So recheck your words and see if you hold any biases, and hopefully it's changed your mindset a little. But that is the end of my presentation. So I'll stop sharing.
All right.
Questions now welcome. And apologies for my Tagalog.
It's fine. It's the same for any language. Thanks for that, Ben. And I think there's a lot of questions regarding this, and it certainly made me think about my actions and the way it's perceived. And in terms of the Philippines, I think we can all agree that it's it's also been said that a lot of the areas are not it doesn't provide help for people with disabilities, but also there's people who are but then it's also anti-human, from what a lot of people will say. If anyone wants to ask any questions, you can also put it in the chat and we'll read it out loud. If you're feeling a bit shy, don't worry. Just directly message me and I can read it out loud for you. On the other hand, you can also press the reactions button at the bottom and press raise your hand, and we will call on you to unmute. And so you can also open your video. There's one, Dr. Victor Paz is raising his hand. You can unmute and turn on your video, sir.
Okay. Thank you, Ben, for sharing your research. And I don't think we've met before, but I was just wondering, for a quick question. Are you well ahead already in your dissertation research on disability, or are you just starting?
So I'm just starting. So I'm going to be looking at overseas Filipino workers with disabilities, and do they have access to it? Where's the barriers? So in the migration discourse, disability is kind of not there. It's quite invisible.
Yes.
And in disability research, migration isn't there. It's more about like humanitarian movement or forced displacement rather than having agency to move abroad. So I'm going to look at the Philippines and what policies and procedures, barriers might emerge.
Ben, have you met Darius Martinez by any chance?
Not that I remember.
Okay, if you haven't, he works at the Diliman Review Journal, and he's a good person to interview because first of all, I forgot to mention that thank you for giving us such a fantastic overview of the research and the different perspectives in disability studies. And Darius has I think a very rich experience as a person that you should at least know about, and is connected also to something that you're very much interested in your research on migration. Just as a long time ago, he was chosen from an interview, etc., for this job abroad. and it was flying colors and everything. But then when and he told me that when they finally saw him, he saw the change in the faces of the people who were hiring him, and at the end didn't hire him. And he has many of these kinds of experiences, and that might be something that will be interesting for you. And if you just look him up, he's well known to all of us here, and he's well known in campus. So you can and he's very articulate man. But more deeply though, I'm interested. I was closely listening to what you're saying, and I was looking. I was just thinking, what is the role of, in your mind, in your thinking, of ethics and stigma? I think these are two terms that might be again relevant to what you're looking at. When it comes to ethics, of course, now even the state, as early as the 80s, have been trying to create, legislate laws, for equal access, for people with disability, physical disability. But as you can see, the way it's applied, it's like it just applied so that it's applied. You have all these ramps that were made for athletes, right? Disability ramps that really don't work, and areas where there's not much accessibility. With stigma, this is more complex, of course, because you do have like a deeper, longer practice of stigmatizing, especially people with mental disabilities and mental health problems. But having said that, society has managed to adjust, and engage contemporary ethics. So I don't know. I was thinking they might be concepts that might be of use to you if you think about it.
Thanks for those reflections. I'll definitely give Darius an email when I get round to writing my email. So
drop my name. Tell me I told him about you. I told him. Told you about him.
So asking you a question like the role of ethics and stigma. So when it comes to kind of ethics and Philippines legislation isn't that bad, but the implementation of it is often where the problems lie. So when it comes to like the implementation of physical and environmental barriers, what we need there is kind of what disabled people organizations have started to do, and they started being more common, and they're lobbying governments. There's the government systems that have it in place, have disability coordinators in place, and it's about advocacy, lobbying, and trying to get their voices heard, so that when things are designed, you take into account different accessibility needs, or you can get workplaces to offer reasonable accommodation to change little bits to accommodate people into the workplace. And these kind of like ethical decisions within the workplace and the way we operate can be challenged, but through education. And when it comes to stigma, again, education is probably the best way. Just understanding yourself, understanding other people, and then treating everyone with dignity. And if you treat everyone with dignity, certain problems do disappear. Not completely, but it certainly helps move our society forward.
Okay. I think it's also something that a lot of people think about, and that's good that Dr. Pass mentioned Darius as well. It's our neighbor in ASP, so we're always chatting with him. Dr. Michelle Eusebio mentioned here, just a comment, overseas archaeological fieldwork practice and discourse have already accommodated people with disabilities, and maybe she can comment further on this, Dr. Michelle? Or are you? She gets disconnected sometimes, and the internet is not good. Okay, but this is also something that she also mentioned, I think this is very interesting as well for us archaeologists. And she sent yesterday, she also sent me a link about chartered institutes for archaeologists. And it's the concept of making professional archaeology more inclusive. And it's something that I guess we can also start thinking about, because in terms of jobs as well as field works, a lot of people will think that archaeology is mostly associated to going to the field. So how can this be? How maybe there's also a question on how we can start. We can adjust to people with disabilities. But and I don't know if this is something that a lot of people are thinking about. And also, I guess the concept of disability is, I guess, changing, always changing, I guess, and always it depends on the social and social cultural aspect. Here in the Philippines, do you see that there's a difference in terms of how people are thought of? Or when you were working here in Las Piñas, and you mentioned Las Piñas, was there a big disparity in terms of how people in so different socio-economic backgrounds can treat disabilities?
I don't know exact answer to that question, but there is generally a theme that economic status helps. So your social status can exacerbate your disability, especially in rural areas where the infrastructure is weaker. But then also there's such a variety of disabilities, and as you said, it evolves over time. So depending on technology, depending on the environment, like certain things that were considered disability in the past may not be considered disabilities in the future. So for instance, I'm dyslexic, so I have trouble with words, with kind of sounds, reading, writing. But if the society didn't value like literacy, then it wouldn't really be a disability anymore, because I wouldn't need to read, it wouldn't be mandated. So that's just an example of like how disability can be a disability, and it can at the same time not be a disability. But then when it comes to different ways of treating people, it depends on the person, I guess. It depends on the family network. Mostly families with disability, from what I've seen, though there are exceptions, tend to be more empowering and try and change society. And this can be done like in schools by creating organizations of persons with disabilities, which are more common. And this is when a group of people with disabilities get together and advocate for certain changes in society. And this has really helped worldwide make change, especially in inclusion. That's kind of different and the civil society organizations, from what I've seen, is a lot more potent here than it is in the UK, where I'm from. And that's one of the reasons why I decided to come to the Philippines.
All right.
So much. The best thing you can do, like when you're doing field work, is, and there's someone with disability, you can just talk to them and say, oh, how can we accommodate you? And then have a discussion and see what ways then that disability manifests, and how you can remove barriers for that individual, because each person's experience of disability is quite different.
Dr. Pass, you were raising your hand. Yes.
I do like your comment, your statement about, well, it's not a disability if the individual is not treated differently or has equal access to others, even though they do indeed have physical limitations or mental limitations. But it just made me recall, we wrote a paper a few years back on and it's part of a discourse in archaeology that maybe you can also tap into. But this time, we do have an example in the Philippines, which you can include in your research. Around 2,000 years ago or so, there was an individual who was buried and he recovered from his injury. So definitely he was a person that was disabled, but he was cared for because he lived a longer life than the time of the accident or whatever. And So it's called like the archaeology of care. So that's the entire sub discourse in archaeology. And I think that's an important example, because it tells us that perhaps it's also the nature of society, the size of it, the construction, and the way they see each other. This idea of caring is crucial to the idea of caring for others and caring for people with disabilities. So I was just thinking that that's an interesting thing that you might like to look into. And the other one is something that I was shocked to see in one of these. I think Jessica saw a documentary or something, or Cara David, and it was in the Bicol region, and they documented and they showed several families with chained members of the family, chained as in a metal chained into a post, chained a cage, because they were mentally disabled. And I think they go wild. And that's account of the members of family. And so she documented this, I think at least 3 families. And it seems the community knew about it, and everyone knew about it, and it's like accepted, right? So that might be also an interesting case study if you want to look into it.
Yeah, kind of like is the old individual models where people are persecuted because they don't conform to society, and it's easier to hide them, chain them, than to include them.
And in this case, the family is embarrassed that because the family member who is disabled will be, will embarrass the family by destroying things or saying the wrong things or whatever, or going wild, disturbing the peace, so to speak. And therefore they literally chain them for years and years. So go figure.
Yeah, that's the important of like this paradigm shift, seeing people not as obstacles, but as duty bearers and have liberty to live their lives, and trying to help everyone access society to the most of your own personal ability. You know, you can lobby for legislation, which is quite difficult, but we can all change our paradigms or shift our paradigms to be more inclusive, to be more tolerant, to appreciate diversity of people a bit more. And it's a journey. You have to reflect on it. Yeah, I'm not perfect, and I've studied and worked with people with disabilities for ages, and it's everyone's got different, but it's just talking to people, and most people don't mind talking about their disability and like ways how it happened, and just don't treat people with stigma and don't stare, just talk about it, and people are quite open to discuss it. And it's interesting as well because you get to see different people's perspective and how they've lived their lives differently, which is social science.
There was also a big study driven by WHO way back, where they looked at the stigmatization of leprosy. The leprosy was a big, there was a big stigma attached to it, and is considered a disability, of course. And I think they've published it in several papers. So that's also a good literature to tap into, and a lot of people were involved in it. But I mentioned that because there are certain types of stigmas that really later on will be not stigmatized anymore. And I mean that's the optimism in us, perhaps, that society transforms for the better as we carry on, and there are things that are acceptable in the past that are not acceptable anymore today.
Yeah, the human rights paradigms really help with that. Putting liberty and justice into right holders and duty bearers. But from what I've seen, is society is evolving quite quickly. But it's especially with like modern technology, with assistive devices and stuff, and also, but the attitudes it lingers. But hopefully, time will change that.
I guess it's also a generational thing, and this, as Dr. Past was mentioning, I think it's a very Durkheim way of looking at society, people have to contribute. So if you can, this concept of contributing to society is very important to many. And if you're unable to contribute, then or in an acceptable way, then that becomes a problem. So which is a very old theoretical. It's already an old framework, but we're still living by. A lot of people are still living by it. There's a question here. Dr. Michelle Eusebio brought a lot of comments, and there's some discussion on the chat. But she has a question. I'll mention the question that what she mentioned. It was surprising for her to learn in US that students who cannot take exams with many students in a large classroom are connected to disabilities, and they have to take their exams in DRC, where when she was working as a grading assistant there, they had to fetch she had to go and bring and fetch their answer sheets as to that institution. She also has a question. Are there schools in the Philippines with disability resource centers to accommodate people with disabilities and special needs? And so maybe this is referring to the younger students.
Yes. So I don't know what DRC stands for, but so I can't. Disability Resource Center. Okay.
Disability Resource Center. Sorry.
So when I was growing up in school, with dyslexia, I got segregated into a different room during exams. And that's because I had extra time, because part of my condition is that I'm a slower reader, so they were intaker of like information, so it just takes me longer to process and to write, and that's just one way that can be a benefit. When it comes to the Philippines, there's two, we call it a two-pronged approach to education. You have the segregated schools, and you have people getting mainstreamed into like public private schools. So ideally, segregation, we're trying to stop segregation because that perpetuates more segregation. And what we really want is that mainstream schools can accommodate persons with disabilities. Yeah. More integration in society, and then it also helps people. To be honest, if you're with someone more often, then you learn about people more often. You're a bit more at liberty to support and understand different needs and be more accepting. So we are in the Philippines. Disability movements are pushing for mainstream schools to incorporate persons with disabilities, but there are still segregated schools that do take people in. I'm not sure how many at the moment, but we're actually looking at the organisation I volunteer for. We're looking at the Sustainable Development Goals on inclusive education at the moment. I'm writing a parallel report on it. So in the next year or so, hopefully we'll find out how they're doing.
It's also interesting. Now I'm thinking about architecture in the public schools. Now that Michelle mentioned this, a lot of the public schools here, from what I saw, but not, of course, not everything, but this is anecdotal. They're mostly low. It's easy to adjust because they don't want to build high. So, and they have lots of land. So it's mostly just one floors. So in some ways, that's also, it's easy to modify. And I really like that photo that you showed of us of your friend, Eric. I think it's her friend. The ramp was wood, and it looks like the architecture. It really built into the architecture of the Bahay Kubo. So I really like that, and it looks like a cool architecture. Instead of those the some of those that look flimsy and all metallic and hard. Even the overpasses are already, they don't look nice enough, but these ramps are also, the wooden ramps look cool. But in terms of school, so that's how they can, it might be easy for them to adjust. I just don't know about how it's implemented in public schools.
Yes, the level, I didn't know about the levels. I haven't seen many Filipino schools apart from Diliman. But some of the common complaints about schools is the access to toilets, which make life quite difficult. Transportation to schools, because it could be expensive, especially when we call it, SEN's got a theory called the conversion handicap. It costs someone with a disability more to do the same task as someone without a disability. So for instance, getting to school, you can no longer get public transport, you have to get a taxi, and that becomes more expensive, and it gradually builds up over time to get to the same ends. So like reasonable accommodation needs to take into account like access to school, and then the physical environment in school, in the classroom, how people learn differently, and then like just basic needs, like maybe some people have to be at the front, some people have to be at the back, depending on and not segregating people always on ability, but based on like just because they got a disability, sorry, and just adapting the classroom slightly to help their needs.
Yeah, and is it in many buildings, I guess it's always better, aside from ramps, there's also some elevators, but this is for motion disabled, of course. So, but that's also one of the most visually striking. It's a bit of an issue, I think.
Yeah, because I think it's 80% of all disabilities are invisible, or roughly 80%.
Yeah.
There's a lot more persons with disabilities than you think about, and all with slightly different experiences and needs. But they do adapt, and they know what helps, and it's just about listening.
Yeah, and I remember this because in my previous university in Visayas, it was something that we really liked, that there was an elevator for some of the new buildings, so it was to accommodate the disabled students, and we had a lot of disabled physically disabled students during that time. And then I remember coming back, and they're all not being maintained anymore. And one of the reasons that I chatted with one of the professors, and they just said that that's because it's not a lot of disabled students are enrolling. I remember thinking that, well, maybe because they visited and saw that you're not maintaining this this nice method. So I don't know.
Yeah, maintenance.
Yeah, maintenance. It's implementation, and then it's also maintenance. So and ensuring that it's available for everyone, even if there's not demand for it at that point. So it's a very I think it's a very difficult for people to think about for them.
Yeah, it's different phases as well. Like if you start missing out when you're younger, then the gap grows and grows from work to higher education, from primary to secondary to tertiary education. Just trying about closing the gaps at all levels, and then you'd probably see more persons with disabilities coming through, because quite a lot of the population do have a disability.
Definitely, and it's something that I thought that it would have been a great start for a university to do that, and then work their way backwards to elementary, to high school, and then elementary. But I guess it's just not happening for now. But maybe I can also, Dr. Michelle mentioned here, she gave a link for Smithsonian event, and there are disabled archaeologists who gave a talk, Accessing Archaeology, a conversation on equity and ethics. So for people, especially archaeologists, who might be interested in understanding how we can further this our practice in archaeology and be more inclusive. So that's something that you can also check out, and I'm sure that Ben might also be happy to chat with everyone who's interested in furthering this study, especially according to the Guild for Archaeologists. Michelle is an archaeologist who's working in the STS of ASP, of UP, sorry, in the science people. And I think it's also, again, I also put in the link for the paper, A New Application of the Bioarchaeology of Care Approach, a case study from the Metal Period Philippines. So you can check that out for anyone who's interested in studying the concept of disability and care in society during at least 2,000 years ago in the Philippines. And this is also, I think it was something that I was also listening to in a podcast about disabilities in the ancient world, how it's also seen. I thought it was their introduction was also a good way to give us some ideas. Okay,
Yeah,
okay.
that's interesting to me, like the archaeology of the past, and how societies operated back then. It's, yeah, these are good examples that I would look into. Not really thought of them from
Yeah, and
different.
I also think it's also maybe this is something that you can also think about, or other people might also think about, in terms of contextualization. How so it's also, of course, 2,000 years is a long time for a lot of people, but for some people working on the past, this could be a very recent thing considering linguistic changes, things like that. So it's also it can give us an insight on how disabilities may also be seen or practiced in different communities here in the Philippines, and then maybe we can also see it in the archaeological way, track it down in historical perspectives, and from there use maybe use these to move forward onto best practices in the future that's also associated to cultural practices that we have today, that's very much associated to the past practices. And Dr. Pass would like to comment
No,
further?
no,
Sorry.
I was just thinking, listening to that recap, that Ben, you're right. No, so far, the words in mostly Tagalog of that refers to disability are words of that's connected to the emotion of pity, no? Or konsana, no, walang lakas, etc. But it will be interesting to see how it is, no? If you further pursue this line of inquiry, whether if there's an exception to the rule of society of whatever ethno-linguistic group describing people who are different or with disability uh, in a more of labeling or term. No? That would be interesting. I couldn't think of something at the moment, but you're right. You know, everything is like a word that's referring to like a pity or.
So there's one good example, and that's after World War I and II, where quite a lot of people came back disabled, and they're like, so all the indicators for like marriage and work, they stayed quite high when they had disabled because they were seen as heroes. But it's kind of sacrificed to the capitalist system. You know, you're sacrificing yourself to the nation, and that's kind of, so it kind of entailed that kind of perspective within the notion of heroism. But yeah, like when it comes to like mentoring as well, like it's really important to
well,
get.
let's take that example. Like like shell shock is a term that usually is used also, right, for that kind of people who have nervous breakdowns because of the war, and post-traumatic syndrome is what, is that a benign term, or is it a term that is it just descriptive really for, and mind you, know, you can have post-traumatic syndrome disorder even if you're not, you haven't been to a war, right? It can be triggered by something else. But I'm sure these are very deliberate ways of coining new ways of describing, and I think you have something there that you can really I like that angle of your research, that to tease out the way society labels all of these phenomena or characteristics. So that would be fascinating to hear later on, once you've accumulated more information about all these terminologies. Yeah.
There's somebody privately messaged me saying that maybe that's also something that we still don't know, or we still have to think about, the concept of high functioning syndromes, or such as those who are very very smart, in a way they're socially disabled, but intellectually they have superpower. So there's also a lot of different concepts regarding how they are treated in culturally. So in many words, they would say, as she gave an example here, they're called weirdos, but they're very smart weirdos. So there's that label. So it's still a social basis. And I think this is a good, as Sir Vic mentioned, this is a very good way to start opening about chatting about concepts of disabilities and how we can integrate it with our everyday lives, because it's not that we don't know anyone who has disabilities. It's just that people are everywhere. It's just that we don't try to accommodate them. So it's a good wake up call, I think, and a call to action. So thank you for that. And what's your next plans for your research?
I'm still doing my classes at the moment, so I've got another year or so of classes before I do go out and do my research. I've obviously done some scoping and literature, a bit of literature review into it, but there's no next plan in the intermediate future.
All right. But you've already talked to some organizations, right? So you can start your data gathering.
So I'm just trying to network and just still learn about migration and disability more generally. And see where it goes, because there's I've got some objectives in my research, but that could be changed when new information is brought to light.
Yeah, it might help if you can speak to some embassies as well, or if you might want to, if you can have some connections regarding how they choose people, or how they approve of people who are choosing, who are trying to migrate. So that's something that you can look into as just a concept of policy making. But I think that we can all agree that this is a very exciting research, and we look forward to hearing from you. Then we hope that before you give your talk, or when you're already done, you can also present this as another BINALOT talk here in ASP.
Okay. Yeah, I'll happy to come back in a few years.
Yeah, definitely. Well, if you have new insights, we're always welcome to go to ASP and have a chat and give us some new insights regarding this through the BINALOT talk, or even informally. So there's always people who are happy to chat, I think. Okay.
Salamat.
Maraming salamat, and thank you to everyone who are here listening. For next week, we will have the BINALOT talk at 9 a.m. because of the time difference of our guest. It will be Glenys Ong, and she will be giving a talk entitled, the title of the talk will be Repatriation and Native American Tribes. So it will be at 9 a.m. But for now, we'd like to thank Ben for your sharing your ideas with us, and we hope that everyone can, if you have a chance, you can ask Ben for more information regarding disabilities, especially if you're interested since we're all interested in integrating this in our everyday lives. So thank you, Ben, for sharing, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you for inviting me.
Of course.
Speak soon. Bye, everyone.
Bye.